if it's worth your while. So give me your all. I'll take it to Mars. Oh, I'll stick like glue inside your mind. Just watch me break it and whisper it. You're falling into me, touch me. I swear you would do anything that I want. So keep us awake till the dawn. Ooh, baby, feel free. I wanna make you sweat on me. I wanna make you sweat on me.
Hi everyone, welcome back to those of you who have been with us this morning, and I hope you had a lovely lunch break, and welcome for those of you who have just joined us to our third year of Grow with Inbound. This year we are fully virtual, as with most things, and we've been hosting all of our sessions online, and this year we're also, as Huble Digital, we've gone global. So far we've chatted to our friends today at SingSpot, HubSpot, we've heard from Stripe, Monzo and Aircall. Don't worry if you missed those sessions, we've recorded all of them, and we've also heard from some of our team in the UK and South Africa. So we're finishing up our day by waking up HubSpot HQ, and they're in Boston on the East Coast, and our Huble office in Chicago will be wrapping things up for us today. So don't miss out on a chance to hear about what's next for HubSpot. That's with Brian Halligan himself. And we've also got a session on what the future holds for search marketing from our very own Dan Golden, and another fantastic panel as well at the end of the day. There are 600 of you that have joined us today. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your, what I'm sure are very busy schedules. I really hope that by the end of today, you'll have some great takeaways from the sessions. Now, I get the pleasure of introducing you to our very special guest for this session, Katie Burke, Chief People Officer at HubSpot. Hi, Katie.
Hi, Jess. Thanks so much for having me.
No worries at all. I thought I'd kick off just by introducing everyone to you. So for those of you who maybe don't know, Katie joined HubSpot 8 years ago, back in 2012, and in 2017 became Chief People Officer. And during her time, she and her team have started HubSpot's diversity and inclusion programs, including also the annual release of HubSpot's diversity report, which is very cool. I would suggest going and having a look at that after this session. Her initiatives have increased women in leadership at HubSpot by 20% in the last 3 years. Also very, very cool. And HubSpot have received numerous awards recognizing HubSpot's culture, from Entrepreneur, Fortune, the Boston Globe, Glassdoor, and the Boston Business Journal. Katie's emphasis on a culture of inclusion, diversity, and support has also placed HubSpot on Fortune's 100 Best Places to Work for Women. Katie, welcome to Grow with Inbound. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Jess. Delighted to be with you. And if we can't be all together, may as well be together virtually with 600 of our closest friends, right?
Exactly. I think Zoom is just a part of everyone's life now. So, so yeah, it's absurd how normal this all feels now. Well, I thought I might kick things off today just by chatting a little bit about your role as Chief People Officer, and also the People Operations, or POPs, team at HubSpot. I think the Chief People Officer seems to be a position that's kind of really evolved in recent years, and is now seems to be very much regarded as a crucial role within an organization. And I think that, of course, aligns with the significant part that culture and diversity, of course, play within business growth. And I thought, since many of those who have joined us today are most likely looking at the incredible growth that HubSpot's seen over the past, well, few years, many years, and hopefully hoping, of course, to emulate that growth. Can you tell us a little bit about the evolution of the POPs function at HubSpot, and the kind of impact that it's had on HubSpot, and whether or not you think it's something that our audience should be ensuring is present within their own organizations?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Jess. So to start off with kind of the title and role of people operations, I think if you look at the things that are happening in the world right now in general, you're looking at COVID-19, you're looking at Black Lives Matter, you're looking at the forthcoming US election, you're looking at issues of inclusion as it relates to public health, as it relates to COVID-19. And so really, I think 2020 has been the year where you realize, my goodness, all of these things have to do with people and places. And that's what chief people officers, in my opinion, do and do well. Then you add to that the fact that in a competitive market, talent is one of the most precious resources you can possibly have. And so Brian Halligan, as you know, is very fond of talking about the flywheel. The reality is your culture flywheel has to make sure it's also not a leaky bucket. You need to make sure that you don't just attract top talent, but that you're giving them opportunities to retain and grow. And so when we think about our role at HubSpot, I really think of myself as the product manager for the employee and candidate experience. And I also think it's really important. It's very easy to see the people function as a cost center, but the reality is when you talk to customers and partners like hopefully Huble, you are lucky enough to hear from people. They say the reason that they continue to partner with HubSpot is our people, it's our commitment, it's our service, it's our support team. And time again, yes, they love our product, because who wouldn't? But they really love our people. And so rather than thinking about it as a cost center and, how are we going to afford this? Remind yourself, how are we not going to afford this? Because people are absolutely critical to growing your organization. With regard to your second question about HubSpot, we've certainly been lucky to go on a growth journey. And I think that's a direct reflection of our investment in our culture. One of the things that we realized when we went to go public was that many companies were lucky enough to have a great product and great product market fit. What made companies enduring was a commitment to their culture and their leadership and their team, and to growing and adapting to the times and the needs of their customers. And so I think we've been lucky enough to really invest and double down on that front. And so I took over our culture team. I formed our culture team in 2014, 2 weeks after the IPO, upon Dharmesh's request. And since then, our kind of team has grown and evolved from there. But I think we've been lucky enough to start with a really strong foundation in the culture code. And then my team's job is to make it real every single day.
Awesome. We'll come on to culture in a bit, because I think that's, I mean, we couldn't have this session without obviously talking about the culture code and the impact that that's had on the business. That's really interesting. I think coming from a services business, I couldn't agree more. You know, our people are our product, and you're absolutely right. You know, they are the thing that make our organization and give it the reputation that it has. So absolutely. So I guess from that then, in terms of those of people that are watching us, what do you have any kind of advice in terms of investing in that function, kind of building that kind of a team, perhaps?
Yeah, so my biggest advice for growing your own people operations org is, even before you make a people operations hire, if you're just starting out as an organization, one of the most important things that you can do is actually write down what you stand for. And that doesn't require a people leader. It doesn't require an investment in core HR. You really just have to start by writing down what you stand for. And this can be super simple, really rudimentary, but writing down what you stand for as a culture can really be helpful in terms of attracting great candidates, but also making sure that you and your managers, as you scale and grow, are on the same page about what you value, how you make decisions, that kind of thing. So I think some people see the culture code and they think that's what they need to do. That's not where you need to start. The second thing that I would recommend that folks identify early is how they break ties or mitigate challenges or conflicts. And that, again, doesn't require necessarily an investment in someone in core HR, but it does require clarity on, okay, if Jess and I have a disagreement, not that we ever would, but how does that get resolved? What values inform that discussion? And then the third thing I always remind people to do early is to invest in thinking about culture add versus culture fit. It's much easier to prioritize diversity and inclusion at the beginning of your journey than at the end. And so if you think about prioritizing very early on, making sure that as you're building out your leadership team, you bring in different skill sets, different backgrounds, different genders, different race and ethnicities, it really gets easier to start on that foot than to catch up later. So those are the three things I recommend that don't require any headcount. Once you think about building out your team, it's really about kind of the core priorities for your organization. So if you're growing quickly, investing in a strong recruiting leader makes a ton of sense. If you're going to grow or expand, as the Huble team have done into international markets, it's great to have someone who has an understanding of international employment law, who can be a great support system for folks through change. And so those are just a few considerations for people to keep in mind as they're thinking about investing in their people organization.
Amazing. Well, let's dig into the recruitment arm of that, and then obviously we can come on to kind of, I guess, the retention side of it, of the people flywheel as you described it. So I think, I think a big question in so many people's minds is how do you go about attracting the best and the right talent across a global organization in particular. And I think, it was one thing when we were tiny and just based in London, it was still difficult to find somebody who was a really great fit for us. And I think that only gets kind of harder as you grow into being a global organization. But HubSpot is renowned for having such a great culture, and I'm always amazed that no matter what HubSpotter I meet, they always seem to share the same values and be the same kind of great people. So kind of, are there processes in place that you have that kind of make that possible? Whether you're hiring for a role in Berlin or Sydney or Boston, kind of how do you make sure that the right person is hired?
Yeah, so I think the first of all, thanks for saying that about our team members. I feel lucky to get that compliment, and that's a direct reflection of our global recruitment team, so hats off to them. But what I will say for other organizations is the mistake I see a lot of people make is in a really crowded talent market, they don't want to offend anyone or turn anyone away. And so they make their culture basically try to appeal to everyone on earth. And so I'm fond of the musical Hamilton. Not sure if we have any big fans in the house, but one of the best lines from the musical Hamilton is, "If you stand for nothing, Burr, what will you fall for?" And I think the same is true of company cultures, right? If you don't stand for anything, if you just say, "I want to attract hardworking, kind people who love coming to work every day," who doesn't, right? I've never met a founder who says, "I'd like to work with nasty people who aren't fun to collaborate with and don't want our business to grow." And so instead, what you need to do is actually really kind of put up a signpost for, this is the type of company and organization we're building. This is our mission. This is what is important to us. This is what we value. Because I think by standing for something, it's a lot easier for people to grasp why they would consider joining you in a super talented and a super crowded talent market. And so that's number one. I would just recommend standing for something. And I think that's hard to do. So a good example for us is in HubSpot's culture code, one of the things we talk about is our commitment to autonomy. And we basically say, you're not going to be micromanaged because we think the best people in the world don't want to be micromanaged. There are people who read our culture code and they're like, I would actually rather go to work with a very clear playbook on what to do every day. And so, you know what? HubSpot is not for me. And that to me is a huge win, not a loss, because you don't want to attract people who aren't going to be happy working in your type of environment. So that's a specific example of something that people actually read and go, nope, not for me. That to me is a win. So make sure that you stand for something is the first thing. The second thing is the reason you see consistency in the values that people live and breathe is that we're actually really thoughtful about how we interview people at HubSpot. And the truth of the matter is that people think that we do it just by magic and we attract great folks. And the reality is it's a lot of rigor. And so what we do is a lot of skills-based interviewing, behavioral interviewing kits that test for the same attributes and really push people to make sure that if they say, I really liked Jess, that's not a good reason to hire someone at HubSpot. What is a good reason is, okay, how did they line up to the specific skills and attributes you were testing for in the interview? And what's the evidence they brought to bear based on their past experience that suggests that they're ready for the next challenge at HubSpot? So that skills-based interviewing, the really deliberate, thoughtful interviewing and investing in interview training, I have never met anyone who doesn't think they're a good interviewer. Almost everyone thinks they're good at interviewing people. And the truth of the matter is, as you well know, not everyone is great at it. And so we've really invested in training people to make sure that they have an eye for talent, but also that their eye for talent does not draw them to sameness. So one of the things you find in an organization is that people have a penchant for finding people like them. So for example, the old example is the airplane test. I like Jess because she's someone I'd like to sit on an airplane with for 6 hours. Well, now none of us can travel on airplanes. So that test is out the window. But also the reality is we know that the best teams are diverse. And so if you just like someone because they'd be pleasant to sit with on an airplane, they're not actually the best person for the team moving forward. And so really thinking about someone who adds to your culture versus fitted, I think that's so important to set the tone on right from the start.
Yeah, I think that is a really important point. And actually one of the anecdotes that our CEO often tells is I think he was speaking on a panel at HubSpot. And I think one of the questions was around kind of the, what they needed to do to kind of grow their partner agency. And I think one of the questions was, I'm really struggling to find people like me. How do I do that? And Bob was like, that's exactly what you need to not do. Like, you shouldn't be looking for replicas of yourself. You need to be looking at plugging the gaps that are kind of missing from the skill set that you require. So,
and I think that's such a reason Bob has been such a successful leader and partner. And I also we have such an admiration for his growth mindset. He's always seeking to learn something, always seeking to add people to his team who add to the conversation. I think that's one of the reasons Huble's been so successful as well.
Yeah, absolutely. His world domination plans are something we
I'm
all
on board. I'm supportive.
Yeah. Amazing. I think so. Just one thing you said, just around the kind of skills and competency, like kind of feeling out for those in an interview scenario. I get that kind of from a skills point of view, that must be quite not easy to do, but how are there kind of questions then that are formed that gather that person's kind of personality and ethos as well?
Yes, for sure. So a good example on the culture ad question that I think helps people kind of get their heads around this is we have a lot of people who love HubSpot's culture, and that's great. But if we're looking for people who add to it, one of the questions we often ask people is, great that you loved our culture code. What slide would you subtract or add to it? What did you see that was missing? And so right from the start, you're asking someone to provide feedback. You're asking that someone be comfortable providing feedback to a peer in a constructive way and a thoughtful way. You're looking for someone who, for example, like our best product managers at HubSpot don't look around and say, yeah, our product's good as it is. They think, how can I make this different? How can I improve the experience of the customer? And so that's a great example of a question we'll often ask. Or for example, I'll often ask people, in your current role, what's great about the culture and what's one thing you wish you could change? And you want people who have a critical mindset, who are always thinking about what they can do better, the environment they're in, how they can make it better. And so honestly, for me, the worst answer is HubSpot's perfect, never change a thing. I want people on our team who challenge us, who bring new ideas to the fold, that kind of thing. The other things we'll ask are examples of when they put the customer first. So a good example is, as you know, we're on a really big mission to be customer-centric and customer-focused. So oftentimes for customer-facing roles, I'll ask, tell me about a time when you specifically put the customer at the center of a decision. And oftentimes, first, people will give me an example that's very straightforward. A customer wanted something, so we gave it to them. And you're like, that's not actually being customer-centric. Tell me about a time when actually your customer focus and your financial focus came directly at odds with one another, and tell me about how you led through that and what that looked like and how you innovated. I want people, like the people that I love most on our support team are people who are like, I stayed on the phone an extra 35 minutes to make sure someone's issue was solved. I sent flowers for a person's wedding because I knew it was a big day for them. I checked in on them in the middle of COVID because I knew they needed a helping hand. The people who go the extra mile on that front really stand out. And so those are some examples of questions that test for elements that add to your culture without just kind of leaning into likability or what music you like.
Amazing. That's really interesting. Fab. I think another thing I wanted to chat to you about, and again, I think it's kind of a big, I say buzzword, not in that it's not really valuable, but I think it's something I've certainly seen a lot of people talk about, which is all around employer branding. And I think, you know, HubSpot, again, this is another area where you guys really excel. How have you gone about kind of building the amazing employer brand that you have now? And again, do you have kind of any advice for partners and other companies that might be listening, and how they might be able to build a brand for themselves as well?
Absolutely. So our employer brand team is incredible. They're just amazing. They do wonderful work. So I appreciate the compliment. But it's funny, when you ask most organizations about employer brand, they just want a quick fix, right? They just want to fix their employer brand. And what I always say to people is a great employer brand starts with a great product. And so if your culture is broken or the employee experience is broken, you just simply can't have a great employer brand, because the reality is you'll have a great marketing effort for 6 months, and then it will fall apart when people start going on Glassdoor and telling people what it's really like to work there. Mm-hmm. And so oftentimes people will call Glassdoor or Comparably or various review sites and say, how do we get the HubSpot package? And they'll often say, how do you automate your review responses on Glassdoor? And I'm like, no, that's me. because we have to live and breathe the feedback that we're getting from our candidates and employees on what we could do better or differently. And so I think the first element of a great employer brand is starting with the recognition that you need an amazing product to get there. The second thing is investing in it. So if you think about it, if you're growing a great marketing team, you're adding people to it, you're adding resources to it, you're really spending time and energy on it. And at most organizations, employer brand is an afterthought, right? It's a very low priority for marketing, or someone on people operations runs it who doesn't have a marketing background. And so one of the things we've done is invested in some super talented marketers who run great events, run great social content, create great content for us. And I really think it shows. And one of the things that's super interesting to us is people tend to think of it as helping with more junior candidates. More senior candidates actually look at more touch points in your employer brand than you might think. So one of the things we're working on now is making sure we have enough content for more senior level, director level folks to consider HubSpot and learn about HubSpot from our executive thought leadership. So I think it's a combination of understanding that in a competitive, talented market, you really need to stick out from the pack, and then investing in the function. And then the other thing I think that's really important about your employer brand is that it be authentic. So I think, for example, one of my favorite parts today, if you go on our HubSpot Life Instagram, there's a takeover from one of our ISCs out of our Dublin office working remotely. And she's showing her like not perfect apartment and her not perfect plan. And she's joking around about the fact that there's laundry and dishes in the shot, just like all of us are, right? And to me, that's what I love about our employer brand content. It's very authentic to who HubSpot is and who our employees are. And I think that's imperative. So oftentimes it'll be wanting to show the perfect, here's my perfect house, here's my perfect work, here's my perfect life. And I think instead what people really want to see is like, show me the real stuff, pull back the curtain a bit, show me what it's really like to work with the humans you work with. And I think our employer brand really lives and breathes that authenticity.
Amazing. Yeah, that's really interesting. I think what it also really stood out for me is that everyone kind of buys into it as well. Like everyone is willing to be a part of it. I obviously did a lot of stalking of you before this session so that I was, fully prepared. And I noticed, your Instagram itself is an amazing kind of advocate of HubSpot and the culture. And, I loved your post about JD and that kind of thing. So I think, I also think that was something that was quite admirable, was that, if no matter who you kind of go to, they really advocating and promoting as part of almost their personal life, their involvement with HubSpot and which immediately gives the impression that people love working there. Because,
well, and I think that's so one of the things we talked about a few years ago was, not many of us are going to cocktail parties at the moment, which is a shame. But when you used to go to cocktail parties, if you were to ask someone, just how's work going? The two answers that were most common were fine or busy, right? And then you just move along. And our goal is to authentically have people, when you say, how's work going for you? I'm working at HubSpot. I love it. Here's a challenge I'm working on, that kind of thing. And so I think to your point, it has to be genuine, but it also has to be something that your leaders lead from the front on. Mm-hmm. Brian, if you meet him at a cocktail party, he will absolutely tell you about problems he's working on. He'll tell you about books he's reading on leadership and culture. And I love that. So it really starts with our founders down. So I'm glad that you feel that way. I certainly feel really genuinely lucky. And I hope that comes through at a cocktail party, but also online if and when you're not able to meet people in person.
Right, absolutely. Absolutely. It does. Well, I feel like that's probably a good time to move maybe into discussions around culture and your culture code. I know I'm particularly keen to ask the questions that we have. So I think just starting off, I guess, with a kind of, quite a lofty question, like HubSpot obviously places an awful lot of emphasis on company culture. How do you kind of define culture?
Absolutely. So the way that we think about culture overall is it's really the litmus test for how people make decisions, operate, and solve for our customers and our company all day, every day. And so it's the competitive advantage of HubSpot. It's a catalyst for our growth. It informs our behavior and decisions. And I think when I think about culture in general, the best cultures in the world actively inform leadership behavior, company decisions, and company strategy at the highest level. And so I've heard people say, culture is the posters on the wall, it's the tenets you live by, that kind of thing. I think for culture to really work, it has to inform behavior in meaningful ways and frankly inform really tough decisions and hard decisions on that front. So by way of example, as COVID-19 struck, there were so many different elements of uncertainty, and there still are, right? But what we come back to is in the tough times, you've got to live and breathe your culture even more, not back down from it. And so what we went to immediately was, okay, one of our values is empathy. How do we instill a ton of empathy in our managers to make sure that they look out for our employees, but also our customers and our partners? So the big slide that we had for our company meeting when everyone was all together for the first time at the end of March was take care of each other, take care of our customers and partners, and take care of the world. And it's really like you lead with empathy even in the hardest times. And I think that's important to remind people. Oftentimes people will say, I live my culture and values daily, but when things get hard, honestly, the business acumen really kicks in. And we always say, no, it's just the opposite. When you're in the hardest situation, that's when you need to be driven by your culture, not catching up to it.
That's really interesting. Amazing. Yeah, I think the, like you said, the litmus test, HubSpot's, I thought it was fascinating that HubSpot describes its culture code as the operating system that powers the company. How, I guess, from that, you know, I think that example is a really good one as well, in terms of kind of, you know, talking to your managers and making sure that they were being empathetic. And I know prior to us coming into this session, we were obviously talking about, you know, some of the challenges that people have had, where you just don't have that human action with people. And we all talk on Slack, and it's really been really interesting to see how it's that kind of same problem of you can text people and you lose all of the context and the tone around that, which is really hard. And encouraging people to pick up the phone and just, you know, chat to them is really important, just to try to deal with what's going on at the moment.
I think that's spot on. I think your point on the operating system is a good one. We do think of it as an operating system, but by the same token, our computers and our phones every so often, let's call it 6 months every year, need a new operating system or upgrade. And so one of our challenges is balancing what works about our culture, which is significant, while making sure we're always keeping an eye forward on what we can improve and evolve. And I give a ton of credit to Dharmesh for even calling it the culture code. The reason it's called code is just because, like our software, we refactor it regularly to make sure it still reflects where we need to go and what we're doing as a company. And so one of the things I love about HubSpot is that we're never satisfied. We're always evolving our culture versus resting on our laurels and saying it's working just fine, let's keep going.
That's really interesting, and was one of the things that I was keen to kind of understand is like whether you do go back to the culture code or whether that's been static, and so in terms of like updating it, how is there like a process around that you ensure that it's constantly being kind of iterated?
So I think there's two things. There's the document itself, and then there's kind of our day-to-day culture and how we act and what we do and all that kind of stuff. And so the document itself is actually, I won't spoil anything, but currently undergoing a bit of a makeover. So more to come on that front. I won't spoil Dharmesh's announcement, but I think people will be excited about it. But it's getting a bit of a refresh. But honestly, that process falls very much in Dharmesh's court, and he does it sort of oftentimes when we're having a moment where we're kind of trying to reconcile something new, where we know something's broken. So he and I usually work through that together. Those are less frequent. I think what's more frequent are moments when we realize something's not scaling or working, we need to adapt. So a good example is one of our values is transparency. We really value transparency. We usually have a company meeting every quarter. Everyone's a designated insider. In the middle of COVID, there was so much uncertainty. We realized that once every quarter was not going to be nearly enough. And so we built in weekly leadership AMAs. We updated our mini company meeting status. We did more board meetings. We were communicating with our boards. We did more director meetings so our directors had more context. And so I think we're regularly tweaking our operating system to make sure it reflects the current needs of the business, even if and when we don't update the document. But I think the most significant document upgrade that we made was when we've only changed one value at HubSpot since we launched the culture code, and it was the E. The E actually used to stand for effective, and we changed it to empathetic because as we grew globally, as you well know, with the acquisition of Empul, when you grow globally, it's more important than ever that you lean into empathy because you're dealing with teams that are working across cultures, across time zones, across different functions, and everyone's trying to scale and grow and do the right thing, but there are ton of regional differences, time zone differences, a ton of things that kind of get in the way. And so what we realized was we needed to really lean into empathy as we grew, particularly as we wanted to invest in diversity and inclusion. So that was the biggest update we made. And when we changed the value, we did a bunch of other upgrades. The other ones are mostly usually little tweaks.
Amazing. That's so interesting that you moved from effective to empathetic, and that tied into kind of you being, you know, this much larger global organization. Amazing. Well, do you have any advice for those who are watching us on kind of if they don't have a culture code? I feel like I would know the answer to this. Should they have one? And you know, what advice do you have in terms of cultivating culture and ensuring that it's followed?
Yeah, for sure. So in the absence of a culture code, which I get can be an investment of time, energy, money, marketing dollars, and can also feel quite daunting. One of my favorite examples, there's a local chef here in Boston named Joanne Chang. She's quite well known, but she runs a bakery called Flour. And she does a letter to her team every year that basically just says, here's what our customers expect, here's what I expect, and here's kind of my dream for the bakery for the year ahead. And I always use that as an example of you don't have to have a perfect culture code. It was written in a Word document. She's done it every year since she started her first bakery and has now expanded to include cookbooks and more bakeries and that kind of thing. And she uses it as a center of gravity for her team to help inform decisions. So if you don't have time or energy, or if the idea of adopting a culture code feels daunting, write a quick letter to your team that really helps articulate what you value, what you care about, and what you're prioritizing in the year to come. Just the act of doing that can help people make better decisions around culture. And then of course, once you get product market fit, once you feel like you're growing, once you feel like you've got kind of a recipe for success, I think investing in writing a culture code is a great thing to do.
Amazing. And do you have any advice for kind of getting started with that process? I think, you know, you said earlier about making sure you don't kind of fall into the trap of making obvious statements about the kinds of people and the, you know, the values that are true to you. How do you think that kind of companies can avoid going through that?
So one question that I always ask myself, I write a letter to our people operations team that mirrors the letter Joanne writes every year that's specific to our team. And one of the questions I always ask myself after I finish the first draft is, what does this give people permission not to do or to push back on? Like, does it actually give people clarity on what they can say no to or deprioritize? If it doesn't, it's not actually doing its job, because basically what you're saying is do everything and do it incredibly well. And I have super high expectations of all of you. And so, for example, this year we talked a lot about the need to invest in diversity and inclusion. And so you could deprioritize something else to actually make that a priority in your search. And by the way, we made it clear I want our team to be leaders on that front, not followers. Second, we obviously had no idea what COVID was about to have in store for us, but we were going to really focus on being adaptable and collaborating within our people operations team. So collaboration, if you needed to put aside something else to make sure that you and I were working together, that was not only explicitly encouraged, but something I'm demanding of our managers and leaders on that stuff. And so I think a good question to ask yourself is, what does it give people permission not to do? And then the second thing is, does it feel authentic to who you are as a leader? So one of the questions I often ask people is, does this sound like the coaching instructions I'm giving you on a weekly basis around what's working and what isn't? And I think oftentimes when we go to write a letter, you and I are chatting conversationally now. When you go to write a letter, you write like you used to write college papers or university papers, right? You'd go like heretofore and for within, and you're like, no, that's not how you actually speak. And so make sure that it's conversational enough, that it feels approachable to people, that it's not theoretical, and that it's actually strategic and informed and written in plain vernacular so people can understand it and actually use it to inform their day-to-day work.
Amazing. That's really useful advice. Thank you. I think,
and then the other thing I would say, sorry, this is a last minute addition. The other thing I always say to people is there's a reason we have 5 values. I do not believe that human beings can remember any more than 5 things in a given time. So the other thing is people often say like, I'm doing a 10-point plan or a 12-point plan. I do not believe that human beings can remember more than 5 things at once. So if you have 18 values or 18 things that you're asking people to prioritize, 5 is the golden rule. So you can do fewer than 5, but 5's the rule.
Perfect. Okay, cool. That makes sense. Keep it a reasonable amount.
That's right.
Amazing. My last question on culture, I think, is just is about how you can ensure that then kind of you know, disseminates throughout the whole company. And again, I suppose it's a similar question around what we were talking about with recruitment. And it's all very well kind of when you're small, it's so much easier to ensure that it is your operating system. But how, if as you grow, do you ensure that everything that perhaps you valued as a smaller group is then disseminated to the wider team?
Sure. So I think a lot of it comes down to the leaders that you recruit and grow and promote even internally. So one of the things we look for is how we make sure that we really value culture add in the folks that we grow and add to our team. The other thing that we do is we make culture a topic and discussion at every Director Plus meeting, every leadership meeting. So we're really talking about it regularly as how are you coaching your team? How are you growing your team? How are you recruiting your team? How are you prioritizing adding to our culture and what that looks like? And we have a new Director of Culture who's based out of our Dublin office. And one of the things she's working on is almost like a mini culture training for new managers to help introduce them to HubSpot's culture, to help them navigate all the resources we have to help drive culture within their own teams. And so that's something we have planned for the upcoming year, which I'm super excited about. But the reality is, I don't think on this one there's a secret sauce. It's about talking about it regularly, keeping it top of mind for folks. And I think the other key is to make it part of your day-to-day business operating system versus an afterthought. So all the way from our board meetings down, we're talking about culture and people regularly. I think you have to do that versus making it something that it's an afterthought that you add in for 5 minutes at the very end of something.
Absolutely. That's really interesting. Thank you. Fabulous. Well, we've kind of touched upon the impact of obviously COVID and everything that's happened. And I think one of the most significant things that obviously that has had an impact on is the way that we work now. And I know we joked about the fact that we're so used to communicating with people through a tiny screen now. We kind of leapt on your announcement around the fact that you've moved from that kind of remote-ish company to being that hybrid remote office model. And I thought the statement that was made in that announcement that work isn't a place was really interesting. And so I was really curious about kind of how you plan to ensure that career growth is equitable for everyone, because I think I really think that is a big thing that typically people have been worried about with working remotely, and kind of what your plans are around that, and how are you kind of going to ensure the success of this new model?
Yeah, thanks so much, and thanks for reading it. So we are going with a hybrid model. To your point, we are investing really heavily in remote, but we're also just investing heavily in the concept that people should have a ton of choice in where and how they work. And so we're going to give all HubSpot employees 3 options. One is to work at home, which means full-time remote. One is to work at flex, which means you come into a HubSpot office just fewer than 3 days a week. And one is to work at office and truly come in every day. And so what that means is we need to build an equitable and inclusive culture that absolutely values and prioritizes people coming into an office if they wish to do so, but means that you have great career growth opportunities, great experience with our culture, regardless of how and where you work. And it turns out, to your point, it's a pretty significant challenge to do that, right? It means we need to take our great in-office culture and our great remote culture and figure out the intersection of the two. And so we're super excited. We have a lot of work to do, I can tell you that much. But I think if anything, if there's been a silver lining of COVID, it's that we know that in building remote inclusive teams, that we have access to better talent now than ever before in all pockets and corners of the world. We have an immense opportunity to create tech jobs in areas where they don't currently exist. And then on the employee side, we have a great opportunity to allow our employees to live where and how they want to live with their partners, with their families, in places that they truly love, and not to have to make a choice between work and life. So that's really compelling from both the company perspective, but ideally from the candidate and employee perspective too. Now, one of the challenges in meeting this decision is, as you all probably experienced, for a while there, it was honestly every single day a tech giant was coming out with a big announcement about what they were doing, right? So Google, Salesforce, Atlassian, amazing companies, Salesforce, all these amazing organizations that we really admire were coming out with these big platitudes around what they were doing. And so there was a tremendous amount of pressure to make a decision, but also to make sure that we were thoughtful about what we announced. And so what we actually did was twofold. We took a survey of our employees. That was not that unique. Most companies, I think, did that and got a bunch of information and context. But then we also put together a bunch of panels, and we learned from a bunch of people we admire. So we listened to leaders who are making decisions just like us. We did panels with recent university graduates so we could get feedback from them on what they're actually looking for in a future workplace. We got feedback from senior candidates on what they wanted, and we all listened and learned together. So one of HubSpot's big kind of overall mindsets is learning and growth. We take a field trip every year. Obviously this year we are not doing it. We take a field trip every year to learn from companies that we admire as a leadership team. And so one of the things we did here was apply that model to the future of work. And those panels gave us a lot of good ideas on blind spots, areas of opportunity, and your notion of career growth, what you pushed on is exactly right. That was one thing that came out, was basically most companies where they do both don't do career growth opportunities for remote employees well. So one of the things we baked into our announcement, we baked into our internal plans, was making sure that we weren't just saying that existing employees could pick this model. We were actually going to make sure that any internal roles that were posted for a manager, team lead, internal mobility director, VP, were location agnostic too. And I think that's a fundamental change. And one of the pieces of feedback we heard from our remote employees was that was the express permission they needed to know that not only will we tolerate remote work, we will celebrate remote work by making sure that we have leaders at every level of the business who work when and where they please. And so I think that it's not just enough to have frontline employees who are working remotely. You need to make sure that there's a clear path for people to grow within your organization as well.
Absolutely. And I suppose coming back to what you were saying about kind of how you ensure that your culture is disseminated throughout your whole business, and that your leaders are really the ones kind of ensuring that is happening. I suppose this is a similar thing in that kind of everybody's attitude very much has to be in favor of it doesn't matter whether you're in the office or remote, to ensure that those opportunities exist and that that career progression exists.
And I think it's important to note that we got alignment on that plan. That doesn't mean everyone is perfectly ready just yet. So by way of example, we have employees who said, you know what, this is fine. We have managers who have said, I miss getting together in person, and I want to make sure we have good solutions to make sure people are personally connected and feel welcome. We have a few pockets of remote employees who don't yet, according to our data, feel as connected to our mission without having gone to an office. And so we have a bunch of challenges we have to tackle, but to your point, we have high level first principles alignment on where we're going, and that makes it easier to dig in and solve problems together. So for example, when we inevitably have challenges with people not feeling the same sense of belonging or connectedness just yet, rather than saying, see, this is why remote doesn't work. Instead, it's, we've committed to a model here, we're going to do this together. How do we fix it? And what ideas can we get from people across the business on how they've done this better or differently?
Amazing, thank you. I've just looked at the time, and I think I've been having such a lovely time. I've realized that we've used up almost our entire time slot. I think before I know I've got a little bit of time, just because the next sessions I think start at 3. I just wanted to make sure we spoke about diversity and inclusion, because it is such an important thing, and I think HubSpot, again, is just another area where you guys are kind of truly exemplary in the way that you approach it. And I truly admire the way that what you have in place to ensure that you do have a diverse and inclusive company. Can you tell us a little bit, I suppose, from your perspective, about the value and importance of ensuring you have diversity and inclusion within your company, and any advice that you have for companies for ensuring that they that is a something that they hold important within their business?
Absolutely. So I'll give you the brain-powered logic for diversity and then the heart-powered logic for diversity. On the brain power, the research is super clear that diverse teams perform better on every single metric. By the way, that includes gender diversity, that includes race diversity, it includes every sort of diversity around. So the output is simply better. So if your brain is powered by facts and logic, that is a compelling argument. On the heart side of things, one of the things that I've always said to people is HubSpot can't be a best place to work until we're a best place to work for everyone. And so if you're just a best place to work for a certain type of people with a certain type of degree or pedigree or background, you're not really a best place to work. And when we think about building a company that everyone can be proud of for many decades and that outlasts us, we need to make sure diversity is a priority on that front. And so the advice that I give to companies is, one, we at HubSpot are very much on a journey on this front. We are not perfect. We are still evolving. And one of our commitments to sharing our report is sharing areas where we can do better. Two, the goal is progress, not perfection. No company in the world that I know of has been perfect on this issue or wish they could take things back or wish they had prioritized things sooner. And so rather than thinking about perfection as the goal, think about progress. And then the third thing I'll hear from people is they'll go, we're waiting until we have a female executive to get started on gender initiatives, or we don't have enough Black employees. We want to make sure we hire first, then start a program. And what I always say to people is just do something. Our first women's initiative at HubSpot was literally getting in external speakers that frankly we paid with HubSpot swag to say like, thank you. We gave them a t-shirt, frankly, for coming in, but they would just talk and provide inspiration. It wasn't fancy. It wasn't this great formal program, but it became the start of something really big and meaningful.
Absolutely amazing. I know for us, we looking at the lineup for today, it was really important, you know, as an example, that we had enough kind of female speakers as well that were part of the lineup, and yeah, I just completely agree. I think just small things like that make a real difference. And
I think to your point, how great is it that we have folks like Bob advocating for that? So a good example on our side is Christian Kinnear, who you heard from earlier, Brian, who you hear from later, Shahid, who you heard from earlier. All of those folks are people that I'm very proud to have as partners. They will ask the question, how are we doing about gender diversity in the composition of our team? And to me, the other thing I would say is don't let the underrepresented groups in your company bear the burden of speaking up on these issues. The more allies we can create, the better. And the more men we have speaking up on women's issues, the more white folks we have speaking up on behalf of their Black colleagues, the better and more inclusive our organizations will be, but also the events that we put on will be.
I think that's a really, really important point is yeah, don't let it fall on those people to have to be the voice. Yeah, I think that's such amazing advice. Great. I'm just going to have a quick look at the chat pane and the Q&A just to see what questions we have. And if you're listening, please do post any questions that you have, and we will be able to answer them. So the first question I've got is, in terms of recruitment in the post-pandemic world, do you think recruiters and organizations will end up favoring remote hires from lower cost talent pools in other countries for a growing number of roles?
Yeah, I think it's too early to say what folks are going to prioritize, but I do think recruiters are going to get better at identifying talent all around the world in pockets where we might have otherwise missed out. And so I think the challenge is actually, ideally, you're not favoring anyone. So for example, I think there are rules where, for example, prioritizing low cost hires is really important. Maybe you're building out a back-end function or a QA function or a support function. You really want to make sure cost is not a factor. Then identifying great talent in low cost environment should be a driving factor. But I would say we're looking at it the other way, which is we are now competing for talent with every company on the West Coast, every company in London, every company around the world. And so I would actually say, if anything, our commitment to competing for the best talent everywhere has gone up. And so if anything, I think you'll see competition heat up for everyone everywhere. And so it means recruiters and organizations are going to have to up their games accordingly. And I think the challenge is, ideally, you have recruiters who don't prioritize remote, in office. They're really inclusive about thinking about everyone. I think that's a really hard challenge, but a really important one.
Absolutely. Amazing. Thank you. Are there any other questions from anyone? I can't see any at the moment. So I think then
there's one more. Do you want
great.
the one on compliance?
Yes, perfect. Great. Yeah. So how are you managing the legal compliance complexities of supporting remote employees who want to relocate to a home country where there isn't already a HubSpot entity?
Yes, great question. So I think on this one, it's all about managing expectations. The reality is, unlike many other big global tech companies, HubSpot, we are still growing. And so one of the things we are really clear about is we will add a certain number of entities for next year, but we have to make sure it's super clear what we can scope and what that looks like, and be really clear and consistent with your employees about that. And so the legal and compliance world in this front, A, is very complex, but B, it's changing every day. So imagine what's happened in the last several months around remote work. I suspect that employment law is going to change by market a lot in the next year. And so I suspect that what you'll see is a lot of those laws changing. And so the advice that I would have for you, which is the advice we're trying to take here, is be clear and transparent with our employees around what entities they can actually work on, be clear with candidates on where they can work, so we're super transparent there, and then also make sure that we're really closely aligned with our legal team to make sure that we are completely by the book in every location where we operate, because the reality is the compliance part of this can have a pretty significant price tag. And I think it's easy, your heartstrings obviously are pulled when someone says, I want to go back and live at home and I want to do this. There's also huge personal tax risk for those folks, along with potential implications for like benefits coverage for their dependents. And so I think it's easy to go, oh, heartstrings, of course you've got to let people go. I think it's important to balance the heart and mind there and be transparent with people around the why of your decision.
Amazing, thank you. Brilliant. Is there any other questions from anyone else listening in? I've got both panels open. I think that might be everything. Oh,
that is fantastic.
One more. So tech companies have been stereotyped, rightly or wrongly, with a bro culture. How challenging was this to show that HubSpot broke the trend / stereotype?
Yeah, so I think the honest truth of it is that the culture is something that you need to keep fighting for. So just because, for example, we've improved our gender balance by 20% doesn't mean that there aren't teams where we need to continue to improve the culture and make sure that everyone is heard. So for example, it doesn't just end with hiring. One of the things I always ask people is, in your meetings, whose voices are heard, whose contributions are celebrated, who do you admire? So a favorite exercise of mine is oftentimes I'll run a workshop for people and I'll say, write down leaders in tech that you admire. And you can imagine people come up with lists and lists and lists, and oftentimes there are only 2 women of 25 folks. And so I'll say, okay, if those are the people you're referencing, the books and blog posts that you're referencing about leadership are all written by white men, how can you expect people on our team to prioritize things? So little things like that make a big difference. And on the bro culture side of things, I honestly think it's about 2 things. One is calling out the behavior when you see it and really calling it for what it is. But the second thing is really, as I mentioned before, creating allies of folks of all genders. So one of the biggest, proudest moments of my time at HubSpot is when people like Christian and Shahid and Brian started speaking up and asking hard questions about gender balance and calling out behavior when they saw someone interrupt someone else. We have a great product leader on our team named Angela DeFranco, and she talks about name dropping other women and hearing male leaders name drop. I admire leaders like Jess, not just leaders like Bob, and I think that's really important. So those are 3 behaviors for people to keep an eye on. I would say we're still evolving our culture and still trying to improve on that front, but I'm grateful that we made some good progress.
That's amazing. And really, really inspiring. Fantastic. Well, I think I'm gonna have to wrap up the session there, as much as I would love to continue chatting.
I think we could talk for 4 hours.
I think so. Absolutely. Well, I think, yeah, thank you for covering all of that. It's been such a pleasure chatting to you, and I hope that everyone's been watching has found this as interesting and as inspiring as I have. Matt, I think, is going to just remind everyone of the competition that we're running today. It's super easy to enter. Just tell us what your key takeaway has been from today, and you just need to post it on LinkedIn. You can include a picture if you like, but just make sure that you remember the hashtag, which is #Grow20. We'll select a post at random, and you could end up being the proud owner of these rather amazing Apple AirPods Pro. Just don't forget the hashtag. Perfect. Now, in 5 minutes time then is our session with Brian Halligan, where our CEO Bob will be asking him all about what's next for HubSpot. I would really recommend that you click over to it. I don't know, I'm sure most of you listening will have heard Brian speak before, but I'm sure he's got some really fascinating insights to share. And I think Matt is just about to pop a link, if he hasn't already, into the chat pane. So thank you again so much, Katie, for joining us. And thank you
for
everyone.
having me.
Oh, it's been a pleasure. And yeah, thank you everyone who's been watching. I will have a great rest of your day, and hopefully we'll see you in the next session.
Cheers. Thanks, Jess.
Thanks.